Silverstone Books presents the world's first audio manga, Harmonics, Rise of the Magician. Written by Collin, Earl, and Snelgrove. Music by The Epilogues. Hear more great tracks at theepilogues.com. Can't wait week to week for your fix? Harmonics is also available as an ebook, and the paperback edition is chock full of extra chapters, exclusive content, and the entire first episode of Season 2. Visit collinearl.com to get it and to find news, updates, and more insane stories.
Crossing synapses, confusing all I know.
Cold as ice. Time: 5 years, 3 days after the desert facility was destroyed. Scene: remote island estate. Nighttime. The German shepherd sniffs the fence as his handler leads him along the perimeter of the estate. Other dogs trot along the opposite side of the property, each with a gun-toting handler. While none of them wear an official uniform, their fatigues all match in color. Other dogless guards patrol the inner property line closest to the house. Invisible to the untrained observer, FLIR cameras dot the property and swing in a steady, rhythmic motion from one side to the other. A short way off from the fence, near the top of a tall pine, a man lies prone on one of the outermost branches of the massive tree. Wrapped head to toe in a black synthetic material, the man looks through his night vision lens at the sentries below. Through the blue-lit haze of his display, the man watches as the sweeping beams of infrared track along the ground around the estate. He is almost ready for his insertion. Slowly, methodically, he pulls out a grappling gun and levels it along the branch of the pine. Using the gun's sight, he adjusts the minuscule laser dots slightly shimmering off the roof of the estate. Silently locking the gun's mounts into place, the man slowly reaches down and wraps his arm and hand along the thick branch that is supporting him. He closes his eyes and remains still for many moments. Slowly, the man raises his foot off the branch at the trunk of the tree and swiftly brings it back down. Gripping the tree branch tightly with his wrapped arm, the man squinches his eyes closed. Moments later, he hears the barking begin, shortly followed by a low crash. Opening his eyes, he watches as handlers attempt to restrain dogs that are now pulling them to the opposite side of the estate. The FLIR cameras all sweep to one side to scan the far side of the house. Calmly, the man squeezes the trigger of the grappling gun. With a quiet, compressed air pop, the hook launches across the lawn and embeds itself squarely in the side of the house. Quickly, the man connects his harness to the outstretched line and slides silently across the span in a matter of seconds. Once at the side of the house, he effortlessly flattens himself against the brick, blending in with the shadows created by the overhanging roof. The man quietly slaps his thigh with his free hand and then reaches out to touch the brick of the house. Astonishingly, he hangs from the brick. Unhooking himself from the line, he stretches out his other hand and repeats the same process and begins to shimmy across the face of the wall. Down below, a guard and his dog come around the corner of the house, running towards the group of others gathered at the far end of the estate. The man flattens himself tighter against the brick, almost becoming motionless as the guard passes him without notice. Tapping his hand against the brick, the man continues to ascend the wall. Finding himself at the topmost floor, he moves laterally across the wall towards a darkened window. Just out of reach of the faint light emitting from the window, he stops and rests the side of his head against the brick. Closing his eyes, he remains there, intently focused on what seems to be something that only he can hear. Slowly, a wide grin creeps across his face. Vice Chairman Reed sat across the mahogany table from the small Jadian man. Reed hated the little gooks, as his great-grandfather called them. Years fighting them in combat didn't soften easily, despite the requirement of political cordiality. But if there was one thing that Reed could do well, it was put on a show. Whether it was stumping on the campaign trail making empty promises to moms and veterans, or sitting across tables from small, slant-eyed weasels that were trying to advance their pathetic empire, his ability to mask what he was really feeling was second only to a chameleon. Finely aged scotch and ice in a crystal tumbler swirled in a mesmerizing motion. Vice Chairman Reed inhaled deeply. At least they had good booze here. "I'm not sure how they do things in your part of the world, Mr. Cho, but the less I know about you and your organization, the better I'm going to sleep tonight." Mr. Cho listened as his translator relayed the comment. The Jadian man nodded and spoke rapidly to his lovely intermediary.
Mr. Cho understands your apprehension, Chairman Reed. He asks you to please understand that his efforts to evolve our Empire's science programs are strictly peaceful, and that our scientists are only looking to protect our sovereign nation from rogue organizations outside of the UWC that would seek to take away our people's freedom.
Reed could barely contain the sarcastic guffaw that welled up inside him. Perhaps he imbibed enough scotch for the night. No use letting the juice compromise his ability to maintain control of his composure. People's freedom, he thought. The only thing free about their people was the amount of free income that they forked over to their oppressive leaders. Reed eyed the small man across the table. His eyes roamed to the soft skin of the attractive woman sitting next to the man. Reed's mind started to wander as his eyes did the same. "What I wouldn't give," thought the chairman. His mind snapped back to reality. Had he any control over his wandering libido, he wouldn't be sitting here trying to deal with the devil to save his own skin. Reed did the math again in his head. If he could squeeze this little man out of at least 7.5, he might just be able to avoid the repercussions of his indiscretions. "You see, it's not that I don't trust you, but, well, how do I put this delicately? The fact of the matter is, I'm up for reappointment in a year, and none of our business here tonight can ever get out," said Reed. Another burst of translation and instruction came.
Mr. Cho could not agree with you more, Chairman. There are many organizations in and out of the UWC that our empire is under scrutiny from. This business, as you call it, will be kept under the tightest of security.
Reed nodded. Maybe he could get 8. Yeah, 8 sounded like a good number. "Well, let's get down to that business." Reed set down the tumbler. "Now, I can't get you all the specs at once. That would cause too much heat. But what I can get is the initial blueprints and research notes, followed by each of the subsequent releases of the schematics." More translation.
Mr. Cho is quite earnest in his desire for the entire program files. While he can consent to a piecemeal transaction, he wonders what timeline you are suggesting.
Earnest? Thought Reed. More like desperate. He picked up the scotch again. The timeline was going to be a problem. Too stretched and his 8 turned into 5. Too quick, and even 8 wouldn't matter as a resident in a 9x6 cell. He swirled the scotch around and around as he thought. Timeline's tricky. The last thing you and I can afford is to have people sticking their noses where they don't belong. The translator started speaking and then looked like she was thinking through this last statement. Finally, she spit out the last little bit very rapidly. Mr. Cho looked at Reed and nodded. "What do you say about a 12-month schedule?" asked Reed. "You'll get the first part in a month, then the remaining 3 iterations once a quarter over the next 9 months." Mr. Cho listened to his translator and then sat contemplating. He motioned for a younger-looking Asian man to come over and then whispered something in the young man's ear. The young man bowed deeply and then replied in an equally hushed voice. Reed didn't notice any of this. He was busy noticing the skirt length of the translator, or rather the lack thereof. Mr. Cho cleared his throat, which brought Reed back to the conversation. He spoke to his translator, who then looked at Reed.
Mr. Cho is agreeable to that timeline. In an effort to secure the transaction amicably, he is willing to offer 5.7.
Reed the chameleon did not let his emotions out of their cage. Despite his mind racing to redo the math, his face was calm and collected.
5.7?
He thought. That would leave him at least 2 and change short. Reed cleared his throat. Well, that is a mighty fine offer, Mr. Cho. A fine offer indeed. I was, however, thinking more in the neighborhood of 8.5. Mr. Cho looked passively at the chairman. As he relayed his lengthy response to the translator, she spoke to Reed.
Mr. Cho understands the risk that is involved with this particular transaction, and is also well aware of the chairman's fine tastes. He is willing to pay 7 in addition to...
The translator quickly looked at Mr. Cho. She bowed her head and asked him a question. He repeated his response to her. She looked dumbfounded. She started to ask something else and was quickly cut off by a rapid flow of guttural sounds. She bowed her head even lower and returned her gaze cautiously to Reed.
7, in addition to my personal services to you.
Reed's eyebrow cocked upwards. Not to be ungrateful for your generous offer, but what personal services could I possibly want from Mr. Cho? The translator hesitated at this statement. As she started to speak, she was yet again interrupted.
Mr. Reed, I was not offering my personal services, but rather the personal services of my lovely translator. I understand you will be here for a few more days. Let her show you the sights and scenes of this great area.
Sneaky, greedy. Now I remember why I hate these little...
Reed did not let his expression change. Inside, he could barely restrain the flow of adrenaline that was coursing through his body. He looked at the translator, who was just staring at the floor. He knew he wasn't going to get a better offer. Well, I suppose we have a deal. That just then, a loud crack sounded. The young man grabbed his radio and spoke rapidly into it. Mr. Cho barked orders to the man and he swept out of the room quite suddenly. He turned to Mr. Reed.
This estate is surrounded by a very old forest. Branches fall all the time. There is nothing to worry about.
Branches, you say? Just how secure is this place?
The highest level of security and detail was put into your visit tonight. Rest assured, you are well protected.
For the first time, in as far as long as he could remember, Reed's stoic face sagged just slightly. He had known this was a bad idea. Well, Mr. Cho, let's get our business concluded and then I will be on my way. Reed glanced to the translator. Or, I guess, we'll be on my way. Mr. Cho opened his mouth to reply when he noticed the air in the room dropping in temperature. His breath fogged in a plume of vapor as he started to speak. He looked around. Everything seemed to be normal. Then his eyes stopped at the far end of the room. Something on the wall looked out of place. The paint seemed to be changing color along a vertical line that started just above the floor and ran up the wall and then continued along the ceiling. The odd line seemed to stop right at the fire sprinkler. Mr. Cho gazed at the line, wondering if he was seeing things. He called to another man in the room and pointed towards the wall. Just as the man started to walk across the room, the clattering began. Pipes jangled and clanked in the walls. Reed had followed Cho's gaze and was now watching the far wall as well. He dropped his scotch. The night had gone exactly as Cho had anticipated. Despite having to reveal that he did not need his translator, Reed's weakness had shown through just as Cho had planned. Bringing the lovely woman along to the meeting was sheer genius on his part. If it wasn't for that disturbance outside, he would have considered the whole thing a complete success. Cho saw the chairman's face dip slightly. Well, Mr. Cho, let's get our business concluded and then I will be on my way. There it was. Like clockwork, the man's lust took control. Or, I guess, we'll be on my way. Cho was just about to reply when he saw his breath cloud from his mouth. What was going on? He looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, why was it so cold all of a sudden? Something across the room caught his eye. Something about the far wall seemed off. Cho saw a vertical shimmer start from just above the floor and continue up past the darkened window to the ceiling. He watched as the odd discoloration continued across the ceiling and terminated at the fire sprinkler. He called to one of the remaining guards and told him to check out the wall. Suddenly, there was a loud metal clanging. Cho looked around the room, trying to figure out what was happening. He caught sight of the chairman, the panic painted on his face, and the now empty tumbler on the floor. The banging grew louder and louder. Cho whipped his attention back to the far wall. The paint and plaster were starting to crack and crumble to the floor. He stood up and started to back away from the wall. Just as he saw Reed start to stand, a copper pipe burst through the ceiling. Reed screamed and covered his face with his arms. But nothing happened. No water, no mist, no nothing. The clanging had stopped. Cho watched as Reed peeked out from behind his arms. The vice chairman stared at the frosty pipe hanging rigidly from the ceiling. Reed slowly turned to Cho with a questioning expression on his face. Cho started to speak, but just then, a hollow pop sounded. Cho watched in slow motion as a column of ice rocketed out of the hanging pipe and skewered Vice Chairman Reed through the chest. Somewhere far beyond the reach of the FLIR cameras and German shepherds, a man dressed in all black runs through the forest at a breakneck speed. Harmonics, Rise of the Magician. Written by Collin, Earl, and Chris Snelgrove. Music by The Epilogues. Hear more great tracks, get concert dates, and buy Epilogues gear at theepilogues.com. Don't want to wait until the end? Be sure to check out CollinEarl.com for the ebook and paperback editions of Harmonics, packed with extra chapters, exclusive content, and the entire first episode of Season 2.
We hope you're enjoying this free serialized audiobook. If you like what you're hearing, please tell a friend. Better yet, tell a friend and leave a contribution for the book at podiobooks.com. At least 75% of your donation will go straight to the author or producer, so please, be generous. And thanks for listening.